Good morning. We have breaking news.
We are going to make this decision now.
The results from the state of Pennsylvania. Those results are in right now. And based on what we are seeing there,
Fox News decision desk has called Pennsylvania for Donald Trump.
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
This means that Donald Trump
is on track to win the state of Pennsylvania.
Will be the 45th.
Become the 46th president
of the United States.
Pennsylvania, the quintessential swing state. Its 19 electoral votes helped Donald Trump ascend to the presidency in 2016. And in 2020, Joe Biden won it back for the Democrats. In a state with 13 million residents, it has been decided by an average of nearly 60,000 votes in the last two presidential elections.
Working-class white voters in the Rust Belt and black voters in Philadelphia typically dominate the conversation surrounding this crucial state. But what's often obscure is a large and growing community of Puerto Rican Americans in Pennsylvania, nearly 500,000, who are poised to be a pivotal vote in the upcoming 2024 elections. In this episode of Nationally, we're diving into a community that could be the margin of difference in 2024, Puerto Ricanos. We'll explore the history of Puerto Rican migration to Pennsylvania, the issues impacting their communities the most, and the potential they have to sway the outcome of America's most populous swing state. Welcome back to Nationally. In this limited election series podcast by Immigrantly Media, we're going to discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked demographic groups in the U.S. As election season fast approaches, we'll examine key moments which will paint a clearer picture of what to expect come November. We're your co-host, Juan Diego Ramirez.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And this is Nationally.
Let's take a moment to look back on the drama of 2022. A heated Senate race between now Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman and his Republican opponent, Mehmet Oz, also known as Dr. Oz, who you might recognize from your television.
I'm running to serve Pennsylvania. He's running to use Pennsylvania. And let's also talk about the elephant in the room. I had a stroke. He's never let me forget that.
It was a bitter contest. Just to offer a taste, the Oz campaign was seen repeatedly mocking Fetterman's auditory processing and speech. And Fetterman suffered from a major stroke just months before the general election. For his part, the Pennsylvanian senator accused Oz of being an out-of-touch elite by constantly remarking on his New Jersey residents.
We need to fight about inflation, right now because it's a tax on working families, and Dr. Oz can't possibly understand what that is like. He has 10 gigantic mansions.
John Fetterman brings up houses. The irony is he didn't pay for his own house.
Both camps made extensive appeals to Hispanic voters in the Keystone State. But in the end, John Fetterman came out on top with the help of hundreds of thousands of Latino voters who supported his campaign by a margin of 68 to 30, according to exit polls. And I think this leads us to this question. Can Democrats count on these voters to come out and show their support in the same high levels as elections in the years past? And this is a key component. Latinos and Puerto Ricans in particular in Pennsylvania really helped to deliver this victory for John Fetterman. But, a lot has changed between 2020 and 2024, as we've explored, JD, in, so many of these podcasts, right? Whether it's kitchen table issues, immigration, abortion, Palestine, voters are thinking about other things these days.
Right. And John Fetterman has come under fire for his more conservative views.
Now, 8 years ago, I was a progressive, but the situation's changed, and I've been very clear that I didn't leave that label. That label left me.
And now let's remember that John Fetterman came from a Republican family, a working class family. So those conservative views are still there.
That's right. And he has been a staunch supporter of Israel throughout this conflict in the Middle East that could start to turn off certainly some younger voters, but potentially some Latinos and Puerto Ricans as well, who might identify with the idea of being stateless.
Going back to Puerto Ricans, in the state, they make up 5% of the population. They represent half of the Latino voters of the state. You can trace this community all the way back to the 1800s. But the population we see today really began to grow amidst the world wars and subsequent labor shortages, like when Puerto Rican men and women were recruited to work in farms, factories, and homes. Since then, hundreds of thousands more have migrated to the state, displaced by an increasingly industrialized Puerto Rico and in search of work. Today, there are nearly 500,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania. For context, that's 6 times the margin of President Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election. What this means is that as the 2024 presidential election inches closer, we're going to see a lot of attention on these Latino communities in Pennsylvania.
And in terms of what that looks like, all signs point to the economy as a major grievance of Puerto Ricans. Polling suggests that the economy is the single most important issue to Latino voters in Pennsylvania. In a survey leading up to the recent state primary, 4 out of 5 of the top concerns for Pennsylvania Latinos were primarily economic: wages, inflation, and the rising cost of living, healthcare costs, and housing affordability. Latino elected officials in the state echo this sentiment, like State Representative Manuel Guzman, who serves as the vice chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Latino Caucus, and referred to the polling as proof that Latino issues are everyday American issues.
The top issue priorities among Latinos in Pennsylvania are consistent with Latino voters across the country: jobs in the economy, inflation, healthcare, crime and gun violence, and affordable housing.
This data aligns with what we know about these communities. Today, Puerto Ricans in the state make less money and are more likely to be in poverty than the average Pennsylvanian household, a product of a slew of governmental policies that encouraged residential segregation and created obstacles to building wealth. The median household income for Latinos in the state stands far below the average, which is true both in relatively rural regions of the state and in major metropolitan areas like Philadelphia. Just as a reminder, many Puerto Ricans arrived in Pennsylvania in the post-war period. So as intense residential segregation continued to take hold in the United States, Puerto Ricans often settled in inner city regions alongside Black Americans, meaning that they faced many of the same systemic obstructions to receiving proper education, gaining wealth, and climbing the social ladder. To make matters worse, Puerto Ricans have been subject to the harsh impacts of gentrification, when higher income individuals move to low-cost areas and buy properties to rehabilitate them, displacing often long-standing low-income communities. In Philly, for instance, legislation intended to encourage development by designating low-income neighborhoods as opportunity zones has caused rent hikes in historically Puerto Rican neighborhoods, forcing relocation to its original inhabitants. And, JD, we're seeing the same kinds of things happening in LA as well. It is so expensive to live within the city of Los Angeles that we have seen so many Black and brown residents in particular moving outside of the city out to what's known as the Inland Empire, these once rural areas that are total heat deserts. I mean, it's incredibly hot out there in the summers, but people can live a slightly better life. They have a better cost of living at least. And so we're seeing historically Black neighborhoods change over, historically Latino neighborhoods change over due to these forces of gentrification.
Yeah, and it's not only happening in Philly, Los Angeles, but also major metropolitan areas across the country, including New York, where I live, where, we have seen rents skyrocketed. An average rent in New York City can be up to $3,000 to $4,000 a month. So these are numbers that people can sometimes barely afford. I mean, the economic situation is even more dire in Puerto Rico, as a territory embroiled in financial ruin caused by decades-long debt crisis. And in terms of what prompted that crisis, the United States government carries a big portion of that blame. Throughout multiple rounds of legislation, their meddling into Puerto Rico has been disastrous for the economic health of that territory. With the landfall of the devastating Hurricane Maria and subsequent delay of proper aid, economic conditions only worsened. I mean, we all saw those images of how Puerto Rico was devastated. I personally went to Puerto Rico a year after and saw the outcome of all of that.
And when you went a year after, what did that look like? Tell me more.
It seemed as if the hurricane had just landed a few months before. So there were still places that had still not gotten power back. There were farms in the inland of the island that were still suffering setbacks from the salt water that had reached all the way to those farms. So we saw coffee fields with mold.
Oh my gosh.
In fact, till this day, Puerto Rico suffers from power issues.
And no doubt, like the Puerto Ricans living here in the mainland are sending money back home and trying to help folks in their families that are still there.
I mean, Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania aren't just struggling themselves. You know, they see their relatives struggling back on the island as well, a territory under American control.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. As in most immigrant communities, you have to think about not just like what does the community look like here in the United States, but their connection to their families, to their homelands. And this is an even more unique situation because the homeland is still a U.S. territory, right? So it makes total sense that the Biden camp would want to do outreach to Puerto Ricans, especially given that Donald Trump has really made, white working class voters his target. And I mean, that was traditionally kind of an area that Biden did very well. He'll probably do pretty well with them still, but he has to pick up more votes if he's going to try and win this. And so really doing targeted outreach to this large community of voters within the state.
And then also when we talk about, the immigration issue, this is not really a topic for Puerto Ricans as they are not immigrant themselves. They're U.S. citizens who can't vote in mainland elections. They're almost like second-class citizens in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, how can the Biden administration win over members of the Puerto Rican community?
Then he's had that luck in 2020. Fetterman had that luck in 2022. But it's not just luck, right? It's based on strategic outreach. And so let's talk a little bit about like Biden's outreach plans or maybe even his problems.
Like we're seeing some initial attempts. Just a few months ago, Vice President Kamala Harris made her first visit to the territory to tout Biden's administration's $140 billion investment to improve the infrastructure, like clean energy and access to capital for small businesses.
What we all need to do then is just supply the community and the talent here with the capacity and the resources. And so President Joe Biden and I have been very intentional about what we are doing for the leaders and the people and the families of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I'll just add, though, that the fact that Kamala Harris went to Puerto Rico and made that trip, yes, is it for the people of Puerto Rico? Sure. But I think it's also sending a very strong message back to the Puerto Ricans here in the United States who are going to be thinking about casting a ballot.
Right. We're seeing active efforts by Democrats to run the margins with Latino voters, whether it be through the vice president's visits or spending on advertising. But it's not clear that this is a winning strategy. Polling data suggests that from 2016 to 2020, Democrats in Pennsylvania are actually losing ground among Latinos.
Are Democrats losing Latino voters?
Yes, they definitely are. I mean, the reality is I think many Democrats thought that voting demographic was baked in their favor. And what we're seeing is actually that more Latinos are actually identifying as independent, as swing voters. They're really willing to hear from both parties.
Yeah, Didi, and this is just that reminder that Democrats cannot take Latinos for granted, and the Latinos are really complex and have all of these differences within. In a poll conducted by Unidos last year, 58% of Pennsylvania Latino voters indicated that they were leaning towards voting for President Joe Biden, while 26% leaned towards former President Donald Trump. And that's well below the estimated 70% of Latino voters in the state that supported Biden last time around. So the situation is even worse when we look at younger voters who are much more likely to disapprove of Biden's job performance than the older Latino voters in the state. So he is definitely losing some ground amongst Latinos in Pennsylvania and has some work to do. When we talk about discontent among Latino voters with Biden, it's really important to understand not just how many Puerto Ricans are flowing into the state, but where they are settling. It's true that during most of the 20th century, Puerto Ricans moving into the state found themselves settling in Philadelphia. But in the last 50 years or so, over 500,000 new Latino residents have actually come to a region called Dutch Country, known for its high concentration of Amish and Mennonite communities. Folks in this region of the state have continued to embrace rural life, and that's part of the appeal for many of its Puerto Rican inhabitants. It offers them a glimpse of the home that they've left behind. This might begin to explain why Democrats aren't seeing the levels of support they might have expected from a growing Latino population. I'm so curious to get your thoughts on this, JD. Like, what do you feel is the significance of these geographical regions of immigrant communities in terms of developing unique political identities? I mean, when we think about Latinos in urban areas versus rural areas, I think it just accentuates how different these communities can really be.
When you think of the Caribbean islands, you don't necessarily think of farming. But there are huge farming communities in those countries. It's the same thing with Puerto Rico. When a huge population of the island moves to the mainland, they're going to try to find work that they're more comfortable with.
I'll just say kind of anecdotally, some of the work that I've been looking at here in Los Angeles and California, if we're taking a look at like Mexican Americans, Central Americans, the political differences between folks living in the city of Los Angeles, who might be super progressive, and just north of the city, still in Los Angeles County in the Antelope Valley, which is far more, I wouldn't necessarily say rural per se, but it's desert, right? It's known as the high desert. Mm-hmm. They have a Republican member of Congress, a prominent Latino, Mike Garcia, who does quite well amongst folks there that have, military backgrounds, et cetera. So there's a lot of distinction within Latino communities, even within Asian American communities. The Vietnamese community, for example, is known as being one of the most conservative Asian American national origin subgroups. And you see a large concentration of Vietnamese in Little Saigon in Orange County.
That's one of the things that Democrats need to work with, people who are pro-state as well, who can possibly be converted to the Democratic Party.
For Vietnamese Americans who settled in Orange County, not necessarily a rural area, but certainly a traditionally conservative area, in terms of their incorporation patterns, their political incorporation, that they are very conservative. And there's a number of reasons why that might be, right? Coming from a Catholic background, having escaped a communist country. But alternatively, when we look at Vietnamese Americans who settled in Santa Clara County and San Jose, a very blue liberal part of California, we actually see the reverse. And that runs counter to most narratives of Vietnamese Americans. But when we take a look even just at registration patterns, we'll see a much higher proportion of Vietnamese Americans who will register with the Democratic Party. And I think that comes as a surprise to a lot of folks. So where migrant groups settle and the people that they settle around, the values that they settle around, can absolutely impact the development of their political identity and their political preferences. So in some ways, it may not be surprising if and when, a majority of Puerto Ricans were settling in urban areas like Philadelphia, that they would have more Democrats amongst them. But now, kind of as we laid out with all of these folks that are settling in more rural areas and amongst the Amish and the Mennonites, that they would develop potentially more conservative ideas and participate more in conservative politics.
We have a saying in Spanish, which is, dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres, which translates to tell me who you hang out with and I'll tell you who you are. And you hit the nail on the head with that right there, because that's true. We've seen that in not just Vietnamese communities, we've seen that across many other communities. But before we close out, we want to highlight one more story on the role Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania will play in the 2024 election. And really, the story is a much broader one. These voters are not alone in going cold on Biden. All across the United States, voters of color, and especially young voters of color, are signaling that they aren't particularly motivated to come out for Democrats in this upcoming election. A lot of it seems to come down to what we touched on previously, a sense that people's economic situations have taken a turn for the worse since Biden took office. But of course, there's a slew of other issues that might be turning voters off, whether it be moderate voters worried about immigration, young voters who want to see a new approach to the situation in Gaza, or entirely different concerns grounded in a specific place and community. one way or another, Joe Biden will have to contend with a growing Latino population, both in Pennsylvania and across the nation. What's his path moving forward from here?
You know, I think that this is what they're doing, right? This is why Kamala Harris went to Puerto Rico and why they're running ads in Pennsylvania. I think they are going to do a very targeted outreach. You know, my sense is that at this point in time, the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, is aware of the differences. I would hope that they're aware of the differences amongst Latinos. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit there, but they seem to be attempting to do some of that work. At least the Democrats do in this instance. And I think that's the job, right? We're still several months away from the election. And voters tend to be a little fickle about these things. They have short-term memories oftentimes, and a lot can change between today and November. And with that targeted outreach, that will be the goal for both Biden, for Trump, also for RFK, maybe for a Cornel West, for others who are going to appear on the ballot, to go after those votes and to earn them. And that is what any party needs to do.
Well, with that being said, we're looking forward to continuing this conversation on our next episode.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nationally podcast, brought to you by Immigrantly Media.
We've hoped that you'd like this episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com or reach out on our socials @immigrantlymedia on Instagram and @immigrantly_pod on Twitter.
And you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram @JUANDR47, JuanDR47.
And you can find me @Sara Sadhwani on all the socials.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan, Shay Yu, and Sofia Sanchez.
This episode was written by Nicholas Black, a recent graduate from Pomona College, with production support from Serene Kader. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. Thanks for joining us.